how often do we really stop and, question the very foundations of what we call good or just? We tend to inherit these big ideas, these ideals, but maybe we don't always think about where they came from, or maybe more pointedly, whose interests they actually serve. It's a really timeless challenge to conventional wisdom, isn't it? And sometimes you find these incredibly radical ideas from like millennia ago that echo in really surprising ways today. Welcome to the AI history of Western philosophy. Now, before we dive into today's topic, just a quick but important note. AI-generated content, and specifically this show, can sometimes confabulate it, might present ideas as fact. And while our subject is philosophy, we aren't philosophers ourselves. The mission of AI history of Western philosophy, really beyond pointing you towards the original source texts, is to experiment with philosophy as material and maybe generate some new possibilities for thought. So today we're bringing together two really powerful, provocative thinkers. They're separated by more than 2,000 years, which is just incredible to think about. We've got the fiery sophist Thrasymachus from Plato's Athens.
And then the revolutionary German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And what connects them, what we're exploring, is their shared project, challenging the very basis of ethical thought, what we might call the genealogy of justice. Okay, let's unpack that word, genealogy. It's not just about tracing origins like a family tree. Think of it more like a critical investigation. It unmasks the often hidden, power-driven dynamics behind the values we hold dear. It asks, why do we value this? And what was it before it became this polished, revered concept?
That's a really good way to put it. Because despite that huge historical gap, there's this fascinating, almost uncanny intellectual kinship between Thrasymachus and Nietzsche. And today, we're going to argue that Thrasymachus' account of justice really functions as a kind of proto-genealogy, meaning he anticipates a lot of Nietzsche's later, more fully developed ideas, but, and this is crucial, with some really important differences. So our journey today will kind of unfold in three parts. First, we'll dive into Thrasymachus, his intervention in Plato's Republic. Then second, we'll shift focus to Nietzsche and really define his genealogical method, its historical and psychological aspects. And finally, third, we'll bring them together in a critical synthesis, looking at the parallels, yes, but also the key divergences. The aim is to give you a really nuanced picture.
Okay, sounds great. Let's start with Thrasymachus. Let's imagine ourselves back in ancient Athens. Picture the scene, the agora, it's buzzing with activity, intellectual debate. Socrates is there doing his thing, asking relentless questions. He's talking to people about virtue, about justice, often leaving them completely tied in knots. We're specifically looking at Book I of Plato's Republic. Socrates is calmly dismantling these everyday definitions of justice, and then Thrasymachus arrives. And it's not subtle. It's described almost like an eruption, like a whole different way of thinking just bursts onto the scene. He's impatient. He's fiery. He seems totally fed up with what he sees as Socrates' intellectual games. He's about to drop a bombshell.
Right. The whole mood changes. He doesn't just politely disagree. He bursts out with this incredibly blunt, almost aggressive claim. He says, justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Now, let's be clear. This isn't some lofty philosophical ideal he's proposing. It's not how things should be. For Thrasymachus, this is a cynical, empirical observation of political reality. It's just how things are based on what he sees around him. And he clarifies this pretty quickly using what we probably call a sociological lens today. He says, look, in any city, it doesn't matter if it's a tyranny, a democracy, an aristocracy, the group that's ruling holds the power.
Right.
And what do? Well, naturally, they make laws that serve their own interests. And here's the kicker. They declare these self-serving laws to be just for everyone else, the subjects. And if you break those laws, if you act against the ruler's interests, you're punished for being unjust. It's a pretty stark power-based analysis.
So if I'm getting this right, he's basically saying justice isn't some universal thing like float up in the heavens, something inherently good we should all strive for. It's more like a man-made tool. Maybe even a kind of weapon used by the powerful to keep everyone else in line. Is that putting it too strongly?
No, not at all. That's exactly the heart of it. For Thrasymachus, justice is absolutely not some transcendent virtue. It's not found in nature. It's not revealed by reason alone. It is, quite simply, a social convention, an instrument of power, created and used by the ruling class to maintain their grip and, their advantage. He's interested in the mechanics of power, not metaphysics. And that's why people often categorize his claim as a kind of descriptive political science. He's not saying this is good. He's saying this is how it works. He sees this pattern everywhere, regardless of the specific type of government. He's essentially telling Socrates and the others, just look around. The powerful make the rules for themselves and call it justice. It forces you to look past the nice words, past the ideals of fairness, and ask, okay, but whose interests are really being served here? It's a challenge that honestly feels very modern when you think about political discourse today.
Right, you can see echoes of that kind of critique all over the place. Okay, so Socrates, being Socrates, he can't just let that stand. He immediately fires back with what we call the error argument. He tries to trap Thrasymachus logically. He says something like, hold on, Thrasymachus. Rulers are human, aren't they? And humans make mistakes. So what if a ruler makes a mistake and passes a law that's actually not to their own advantage? Well, if justice is just obeying the law, then sometimes it would be just for subjects to do things that harm the stronger, which contradicts your definition.
Yeah, Joe.
Or so he thinks.
But Thrasymachus is, well, he's slippery, or perhaps just more committed to his core insight. He doesn't concede. Instead, he makes this really critical pivot. He refines his terms. He introduces the idea of the ruler in the precise sense, the true ruler. He uses an analogy, like a craftsman. A doctor, insofar as they are a true doctor acting precisely as a doctor, doesn't make errors that harm the patient. If they do, they're not acting as a doctor at that moment. Similarly, a true ruler, for Thrasymachus, by definition, does not make errors about their own advantage. If a ruler makes a mistake that harms themselves, they aren't ruling in the precise sense at that moment. And this isn't just playing with words. It's a shift towards an idealized model of, frankly, perfect power and exploitation, and the embodiment of this ideal. For Thrasymachus, it's the tyrant who achieves massive success, who gets called happy and blessed, precisely because they commit perfect injustice on the grandest scale. They understand power and use it ruthlessly. So for Thrasymachus, the life of the perfectly unjust person is actually superior. It's the better life. He explicitly says injustice on a grand scale is stronger, freer, and more masterly than justice, and the just person. Yeah. They're just a naive simpleton, cluelessly allowing themselves to be exploited, like a sheep being fattened up for the shepherd's table. Their sense of justice makes them weak, makes them victims.
Wow. That's intense. He's not just redefining justice, he's actively scorning people who follow the rules, calling them fools, essentially. And when he dismisses Socrates' careful questioning as just Socrates' usual irony, it feels like more than just disagreement. Is he actually attacking the whole Socratic method, the idea of using dialectic to find truth?
He absolutely is. You've put your finger on something really fundamental. His contempt isn't just personal annoyance, it's a deep methodological clash. He rejects that slow, back-and-forth Socratic dialectic, that search for universal definitions for questioning. He finds it tedious, probably because he thinks he already knows the answer, and it's an answer grounded in reality, not abstract definitions. He prefers, well, rhetoric, persuasion based on empirical observation on how things actually work in the political world. He's acting more like a political analyst, maybe a sociologist, pointing to the hard facts, not a metaphysician searching for eternal forms. His whole project is fundamentally anti-essentialist. He has zero interest in discovering some timeless, capital J justice that exists separate from human affairs. Instead, he wants to expose how its meaning is contingent, how it changes depending on who's in power and what serves their interests. That's why he pushes back when Socrates tries to define justice as the beneficial, because that implies some universal good exists, which Thrasymachus' realism just completely rejects. There's no universal good, only specific advantages for specific people. And this whole approach, we can really call it a genealogical unmasking. He's trying to strip justice of its shiny, revered status, pull back the curtain and show its rather sordid origins in the raw self-interest of the powerful. And the goal is practical. He wants to change how people think so they change how they act. He wants his audience to throw off what he sees as the chains of conventional morality and pursue their own advantage, just like the successful tyrant does. By grounding everything in political reality first, Thrasymachus is basically saying philosophy is naive until it answers the question, who makes the rules? Political analysis has to come before metaphysics or ethics. It's a huge challenge. And you could argue that the entire rest of Plato's Republic is this monumental effort to defend philosophy and a very different idea of justice against precisely this potent genealogical attack.
That really sets the stage. The idea that philosophy has to grapple with power first. It's a powerful, maybe uncomfortable thought. It makes you see Plato's work in a new light, almost as a direct response. Okay, so let's jump forward now, way forward. Over 2,000 years, from that Athenian marketplace to 19th century Germany. Here we find Friedrich Nietzsche, another thinker who, in a totally different world, picks up a strangely similar thread. this critical investigation into morality, and he explicitly calls his method genealogy. But for him, it wasn't just history. It was a tool, a polemical and diagnostic tool, as you said earlier, a way to critique moral values by questioning the value of these values themselves. He wanted to know, why do we hold these beliefs? Are they actually good for us? Or maybe not.
Exactly. And Nietzsche's genealogy is a very distinctive method, quite different from how philosophers traditionally operated. Its main goal is to uncover the origins of our concepts we usually take for granted as eternal, natural, maybe even divinely inspired. But Nietzsche wanted to show their messy, contingent, sometimes brutal, all too human beginnings. He really attacked what he saw as the traditional philosopher's lack of historical sense. He called it Egyptianism. You know, like the Egyptians built monuments to last forever, symbolizing permanence. Nietzsche thought philosophers did that with concepts. They dehistoricized them, treated them like unchanging statues, turned them into lifeless mummies. His genealogy, though, was about digging up those mummies, seeing how they lived and changed and evolved, tracing their life history, not just admiring their static form. So a Nietzschean genealogy doesn't look for one single pure origin and ursprung. That's just more mummy making. Instead, it traces the complex lines of descent, Herkunft, and emergence in Stimmung. It shows how a concept's meaning, its function, its purpose has shifted dramatically over time, accumulating layers like sediment. And he used this really interesting interdisciplinary approach. He'd look at etymology, word origins, seeing them as clues to lost moral worlds. He can find that with conjectural sociology and deep psychological analysis. It was all about excavating these layers hidden in our moral language, trying to get back to the initial impulses, the power dynamics that gave birth to these ideas in the first place. Only then, he thought, could we really evaluate their worth now.
And the prime example of this, place where he really lays it all out, is the first essay of his book on the genealogy of morals. This is where he tells that incredible, almost mythic story about how our whole moral system got flipped upside down, this slave revolt in morality.
Yes, that first essay is just a tour de force of his method. He contrasts two fundamental moral systems. First, there's master morality. He associates this with a noble, aristocratic, powerful ruling class. Think ancient warriors, confident, strong, vital. These masters, Nietzsche says, in a spontaneous act of just affirming who they are, designated their own qualities, strength, health, power, freedom, joy, as good. It just flowed from their sense of self. And the weak, the powerless, they weren't seen as evil. They were just bad, unfortunate, maybe pitiable, but mostly just an afterthought, defined by what they lacked. This master morality is all about action, strength, affirmation. It springs from vitality. They don't need to justify it. Their power is their justification. It's a yes to life as they live it.
Okay, but then comes this great historical transformation, as you called it, the slave revolt in morality. It sounds like where everything gets turned on its head. How did that actually work? How did the slaves revolt?
Right. This is the absolute pivot in Nietzsche's story. And it's not a physical revolt, not with swords and shields. It's psychological.
Oh, no.
It's spiritual. He argues it was initiated by the oppressed, specifically by what he calls the priestly caste. These are people who are physically weaker than the warrior masters, unable to challenge them directly. So what happens to their aggression, their resentment? It simmers, it turns inward, and it generates this powerful, poisonous emotion Nietzsche famously calls ressentiment. This isn't just being vaguely resentful. It's a deep, festering hatred born from impotence. But crucially, it becomes creative. It finds an outlet in reshaping morality itself. In what Nietzsche calls an act of the cleverest revenge, these priestly figures, fueled by ressentiment, invert the entire aristocratic value system. The master's strengths, pride, power, aggression, health are relabeled as evil. And conversely, the slave's own characteristics, humility, patience, pity, obedience, suffering, weakness, are elevated and praised as good. It's a breathtakingly audacious move. It's a revaluation of all values. They couldn't win on the battlefield, so they changed the rules of the game entirely, winning a spiritual victory by defining the very terms of good and evil. And this narrative is absolutely central to Nietzsche's genealogy. It's a radical rethinking of where power actually lies in history. He's showing that major historical change isn't just driven by brute force, by the obviously strong. It can be driven by the covert, psychological, creative power of the weak. The power to create and impose values emerges as a distinct and maybe even more enduring form of power than just political might. It really complicates that simple Thrasymachus equation of strong equals powerful. The will to power, Nietzsche shows, can work in much subtler, more insidious, and ultimately world-transforming ways.
That's a deeply unsettling way to think about where values came from, almost like they were born out of spite, in a way. So if that's the grand historical narrative, how does Nietzsche bring this down
to the individual level, to things like guilt and conscience, which feels so personal, so internal.
He definitely connects it. He doesn't just leave it at the level of historical castes. In the second essay of the genealogy, he tackles the origin of what he calls the bad conscience. That's that nagging feeling of guilt, that tendency we have to see ourselves as inherently flawed, as sinners. Where did that come from? His argument is, again, really provocative. He suggests it arose when early humans were forced out of their free, instinctual nomadic state and into the confines of society, of communities, of the state. Suddenly, our natural animal instincts for aggression, for cruelty, for dominance instincts that used to have external outlets like hunting or fighting, they had nowhere to go. So Nietzsche argues they were turned backwards against man himself. We started directing that aggression inward, this internalized cruelty, this self-attack that's the origin of guilt, of the bad conscience. We became our own tormentors. And he also does this fascinating etymological work showing how guilt, Schuld in German, originally just meant debt. It's purely transactional, like owing money. And punishment, Strafe, wasn't about moral correction. It was often just the creditor's right to inflict pain, literally, as repayment for that debt. It was brutal, premoral. It was only much later, he argues, under the influence of the slave morality, especially the priestly interpretation, that these concepts got loaded with moral weight, internalized, spiritualized, turned into tools for self-flagellation. A material debt became a deep spiritual flaw. And then, in the third essay, he identifies the ascetic ideal, the high value placed on things like poverty, humility, chastity, self-denial, even suffering as the ultimate expression of this whole trend. He sees it as a way to give meaning to suffering, sure, which is psychologically potent. But it does so, he claims, at the cost of denigrating earthly existence itself. It turns our will away from life, away from affirming our instincts, toward rejecting the world. It represents a state where, as he famously and disturbingly put it, man would rather will nothingness than not will. It's a profound critique of what he saw as the life-denying core of prevailing Western morality.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to take in. It feels like a complete demolition job on conventional morality, digging into history, psychology, language, everything. So now we have these two powerful critiques laid out. Thrasymachus' hard-nosed political realism from ancient Athens and Nietzsche's sweeping historical psychology from 19th century Germany. The big question then is, how do they really stack up against each other? What are the deep connections, and where do they fundamentally part ways?
Right. That's exactly where we need to go now, because putting them side by side really illuminates both thinkers. It shows the shared ground in their critical project, but also the profound differences in their methods, scope, and ultimately their conclusions about power and human nature. We've seen the fire of Thrasymachus and the intricate excavation of Nietzsche. Let's bring them into direct comparison now and see if we can get a really clear verdict on that Proto-Genealogy label for Thrasymachus.
Okay, let's start with the parallels, because on the surface at least, they both seem to be doing this kind of unmasking thing, right? Tearing down the facade to show something more basic, maybe uglier underneath. What's the core common ground there?
Absolutely. That shared critical stance is probably the most immediate parallel. You could call both Thrasymachus and Nietzsche immoralists. Now, that doesn't mean they want chaos or think anything goes. It means they challenge the dominant morality of their time from an outside critical perspective. They both aim to unmask a morality, to strip away its claims to being objective or divine or inherently good or self-evident. Thrasymachus' very direct, reductive phrase, justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. That's a deflationary move. And Nietzsche's entire historical project, showing the contingent origins of values, is also profoundly deflationary. Both reveal morality as a human construction, rooted in dynamics of power and self-interest. At the heart of both is this social constructionist idea. Values aren't found, they're made by specific groups to serve their own ends. They both force us constantly to ask that question, cui bono? Who benefits?
So that famous phrase, might makes right, seems relevant to both, at least in some sense. But do they mean the same thing by might? Is it the same kind of power that's defining what's right?
That's a great question, and it's where we start seeing important nuances even within the parallels. For Thrasymachus, might makes right is quite literal and political. The stronger group is the one holding political power, the ruling body. They define justice directly through making laws. It's straightforward legislative power. For Nietzsche, with his master morality, the might is initially more about inherent vitality, strength, self-confidence. The noble masters define good simply by being powerful and affirming themselves. They don't necessarily need laws to establish their value emanates from their very nature. But despite that difference, both thinkers do present a kind of power justification, the idea that the actions and characteristics of the powerful become the standard of value, and that their power entitles them to more resources, more deference. Thrasymachus clearly admires the tyrant for his effective use of power. And Nietzsche's nobles, similarly, feel no need to apologize for or justify their goodness. It's just a natural consequence of their superior existence.
Okay, so there's a shared skepticism, a focus on power, even if the type of power differs slightly. But this is where their methods seem to really diverge sharply, right? This feels like the point where the comparison gets really interesting, but also complicated, the methodological chasm.
It is, and it's probably the single biggest reason why we label Thrasymachus a proto-genealogist rather than a full genealogist like Nietzsche. Think about the time axis. Genealogy, for Nietzsche, is fundamentally about history, about change over time. Thrasymachus' analysis is basically synchronic. He's giving us a snapshot, a description of a political structure rulers make self-serving laws called justice that he believes holds true at any given time in any city. It's a theory of how justice functions now, or always. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is profoundly diachronic. He's telling a story, a grand narrative of historical transformation spanning millennia. He's explaining how our current Western morality came to be what it is, tracing its evolution, its twists and turns.
Right. You can really see that difference. Thrasymachus is looking at the chessboard right now. Here are the pieces. Here are the rules of power. Nietzsche is asking, how did this chessboard even get built? How did the pieces get their shapes and moves over thousands of years? It's a totally different timescale. And what about their approach, their disciplinary lens? If Thrasymachus is like a political scientist, what's Nietzsche?
That distinction holds up really well, too. Thrasymachus operates like a political sociologist. His key terms are concrete, political. Rulers, subjects, laws. The origin of justice is clear and direct. The will of the people currently in charge. His focus stays within that observable political sphere. Nietzsche. He's more like a historical psychologist, maybe even a kind of philosophical anthropologist. His key terms are deeper, more psychological, more cultural. Castes, warrior versus priest. Psychological drives like ressentiment, the will to power, internalized instincts. He's deciphering what he calls a complex cultural hieroglyph, using etymology, psychology, history. He's digging way below the surface of laws into the deep structures of the human psyche and its historical transformations. It's a much more layered, complex excavation.
That clarifies it hugely. One is surface structure, the other is deep historical evolution. Which brings us then to what you flagged as the most crucial divergence, how they see the strong and the weak. This has to be where the comparison really hits its limit.
It really is. This is the defining difference, the point where the analogy, powerful as it is, breaks down. Let's start with the strong. For Thrasymachus, stronger is a purely political term. It just means whoever holds sovereign power in the state right now. The tyrant, the assembly, the aristocracy, whoever makes and enforces the laws. Strength is about political position. For Nietzsche, the masters or nobles are more of a psychophysical type, defined by inherent qualities, health, vitality, courage, self-affirmation. It's about their nature, their constitution, not just their current political office. They are strong in themselves. But the absolute definitive point of departure is the role of the weak. This is where they go in completely opposite directions. For Thrasymachus, the weak are simply the ruled. The naive simpletons, the sheep, they are passive objects of power. They get duped, they get exploited. They have no agency in creating values. They just obey or suffer. For Nietzsche, however, the weak, specifically that priestly caste, are the most important agents in moral history. Their ressentiment, born of weakness, becomes this incredibly creative, world-altering force. They might be physically weak, but they possess the psychological power to redefine reality, to invert values, and ultimately to spiritually conquer the physically strong masters.
So Thrasymachus sees a static picture. Strong, dominate weak, end of story. Nietzsche sees a dynamic revolution where the weak fundamentally change the game.
Exactly. Thrasymachus' model is one of stable domination. The strong impose values. The weak accept them, or are forced to. There's no real mechanism in his account for the weak to overturn the system ideologically. The sheep remain sheep. Nietzsche's whole story is about a successful ideological revolution from below. He shows how a different kind of the power to create values, to shape beliefs, can be seized by the apparently powerless to overthrow the physically powerful. So the core difference boils down to this. Thrasymachus sees power imposing values. Nietzsche sees the creation of values as the ultimate expression of power, a power the weak can wield more effectively than the strong in the long run. And that is the crucial leap. That's the difference between a proto-genealogy, a brilliant critical snapshot, and a complete dynamic genealogy that explains historical transformation through the lens of value creation as power. Thrasymachus spots the power play, Nietzsche charts the evolution of the power play itself. If you were to sum it up, Thrasymachus critiques conventional justice, saying it's just the ruler's advantage, defined politically, observed synchronically. Justice is a tool, the weak are passive. Nietzsche critiques Judeo-Christian morality, says it came from a slave revolt fueled by ressentiment, defined by psychophysical types, observed diachronically through historical psychology. Justice is a historically evolved concept, and the weak are the key agents of change. #, conclusion.
Okay, so putting it all together, it seems undeniable that Thrasymachus is a proto-genealogist. His unmasking of justice, his focus on power and self-interest, it's a really radical critique for its time, and it absolutely anticipates the spirit of Nietzsche's project, that deflationary move. Both of them, in their own very different ways, force philosophy and us to confront that really uncomfortable idea. Maybe our highest ideals aren't so pure. Maybe they're tangled up with power, with interests, with very human motivations.
That's right. The connection is real and important. But as we've hammered out, the limitations of that comparison are just as vital. Thrasymachus gives us that sharp, static, political-sociological snapshot. It's powerful, but it's still a snapshot. Nietzsche offers this vast, dynamic, historical, psychological epic. It's about transformation, evolution, the deep history of the psyche. And that fundamental difference really rests on their view of agency. Thrasymachus sees power flowing one way. Nietzsche reveals the astonishing, creative, world-changing power that can arise from apparent weakness, the power to redefine reality itself through values.
And, this genealogical gaze, this whole approach of questioning where our values come from and whose interests they serve, it didn't stop with Nietzsche. You see it continue with later thinkers, people like Michel Foucault, for instance. It seems to be this permanent, necessary tool for critical thinking, a way to keep philosophy honest, maybe, to constantly look behind the curtain.
It absolutely is. It compels us always to move beyond just asking the abstract question, what is justice? And instead to ask those more unsettling, maybe more urgent questions, whose justice are we talking about? And what purpose does this idea, this value, truly serve right here, right now? Those are questions that never really lose their relevance, do they? They push us to be more critical about the values we just sort of absorb.
A perfect place to leave it for some reflection. We really hope this exploration of Thrasymachus and Nietzsche has given you some new angles, some new questions to chew on. If you enjoyed this deep dive from the AI history of Western philosophy, please do consider liking, subscribing, or maybe leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought. Your engagement really does help us keep exploring these fascinating and sometimes challenging ideas. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.